All right, so we are joined from right here in Jackson by Darian Denman, the owner of Denman Law, founder of Denman Law, local attorney. This is our business law class. We've got a room full here with me at Velma Jackson High School, and we're recording this for our friends at Madison Central, Germantown High School, Regional High School, and our YouTube channel. So thank you so much.
Wow.
Thank you so much for joining us today. Like I said, this is our business law class, and we've had different legal guests of various aspects of the law. And one thing we like to talk about is that just because you have an attorney or need an attorney doesn't mean somebody's going to jail. Uh,
Right.
Two,
Absolutely.
what you see in a courtroom is not what you see on Law and Order. And three, there are things that you need to know as an employee or an employer that could save you a lot of money and that you have rights to here in Mississippi and anywhere in the country. So we'll talk about a lot of that today. So before we get into what all it is you do, we like to hear about the background of our speakers. And I know you are from right here in Jackson and went to
I
Southern
am.
went to University of Southern Mississippi like myself, and then went to law school in Washington D.C. at Howard University, very prestigious HBCU. So take us through your high school to college to law school transition.
Okay, well, I'm gonna pretend like it wasn't that long ago, but I was born and raised here in Jackson, graduated from Bailey, class of 98. Bailey now, which is so depressing to me, is a middle school. But at the time I was there from 6th through 12th grade. It was a middle school and a high school. I left there and I initially actually started my freshman year at FAMU, which is a HBCU in Tallahassee, Florida. Um, I left there with a 4.0, but it wasn't my favorite. I missed home a little bit, so I came home to the University of Southern Mississippi, and I think that was the best decision I could have ever made because I absolutely loved it. Socially, great friendships, great relationships that I developed, and I learned a lot at the famous Joseph Green Hall, which was the business school at Southern Miss. And so it was just a great experience. And so I highly recommend if anybody's interested in Southern Miss, definitely check it out. And then, of course, I knew since 1995 that I definitely wanted to go to law school and I definitely wanted to go to Howard University. I had other options, which was great. We've got two great law schools right here in the state at Ole Miss and Mississippi College, but I was determined to go to Howard Law School and I got in, I got a scholarship and went to DC. Wasn't quite ready for the weather adjustment with the snow and ice, but the city is great, the people is great, and the people were great and the history of the school is so important. It's a huge part of the civil rights movement, and so there's no replacing that education that I got at Howard Law School.
Yeah, and you mentioned about the history of Howard as one of the most prestigious HBCUs in the country, not just in the country but in the world. And coming from Bailey High and JPS, then Southern Miss, which is a PWI, which is to me still the most racially diverse campus in the state of Mississippi, and it's remained that
I
way.
agree.
And it's something they pride themselves on. But then you go from a PWI to an HBCU. I know I love hearing pros and cons because as these young people are thinking about college, obviously everybody can't be an attorney, but it's important to understand the pros and cons of both because PWIs like Southern Miss offer things that are great that maybe an HBCU cannot, but HBCUs like Howard also offer things that a PWI could not. So talk a little bit about the contrast between the two and how both of them benefited you.
Well, great education in both locations, obviously. Both have beautiful campuses. Our main campus is located in the middle of downtown DC, so it's a little bit more open than maybe Southern Miss is, but it's a beautiful campus. The law school, of course, is across town from the main campus, but they have a shuttle system that'll take you on the other side of DC to that law school. Howard also has a medical school, a dental school, a pharmacy school, and a divinity school. So it's a huge campus with a lot of different careers that you can develop at Howard. Um, the difference, I would say, and I hate saying this, it was just a little bit more. I would say there were more steps to doing things. My experience when I went I'll say this: when I left FAMU, I had to do a lot of different steps to get paperwork and things like that. And so, and of course, things have vastly improved because back then we didn't have
Oh,
Zoom and we didn't have such automated systems for registering and financial aid and all of that. And so that transition to Southern Miss was totally different. It was a lot more seamless at Southern Miss, I will say. But again, those things have vastly improved from even years ago when I was in college. But the experience at both places was really great. Obviously, because of the diversity at Southern Miss, that is not as much so at Howard. I will say that it's different now. But when I was at Southern Miss, I got to meet a lot of different people, different perspectives. Not everyone will agree with you, and it's good going out into the world. You need that. You need to know that everybody's not going to think like you, everybody's not going to act like you, and everybody's not going to immediately accept you. That doesn't mean you change yourself, but you understand that when I go out into this business world or in the legal world, these may be some of the challenges that I face. However, at Howard, they prepare you for that as well, just to so that you know that this is what you may come up against. And so it's kind of drilled into you. You be ready, always be prepared, answer questions, and don't change yourself to fit somebody else's box. You, be the best version of you, and be professional and do what you have to do.
Yeah. And again, one thing I always say, and I know they get sick of me saying this, historically black doesn't mean exclusively black. There is a
Right.
huge international population at Howard, just like there is at Jackson State. So the growth of diverse populations at HBCU is also something that I think people should look into if they want a diverse education, because that is something that has it was already big, but it has changed drastically in the last 10 years at the local and national HBCUs to have a more diverse campus. So that is something I hope everybody considers in finding the best college fit for them, whether it be undergrad or grad school. So now, I know you deal with employment law and you deal with business law. So we're going to talk about the employment side first, because one thing we talk about is that as an employee in the state of Mississippi, there are things you are entitled to, whether you're 15 or whether you're 115. There's things you have to pay for, obviously, because everybody's paying Social Security, everybody's paying Medicaid, the state, and the federal tax. But I think it's important for these kids to know that they don't need to let people take advantage of them, and they don't need to be injured. They don't need to have to work more than hours than they're required. And that's just the ones that we talked about. So what are some things as far as employees to have rights to here in the state of Mississippi that you think these young people ought to know about?
Well, let me be honest and say that when it comes to the body of employment law, Mississippi is um, it's not the most progressive. And I'll say that, for instance, I'm licensed to practice in Georgia and in DC as well. In DC has a state law version called of sort of like Title VII, ADA, all of that. It's called the DC Human Rights Act, and it gives a state law version of certain rights that workers are entitled to in the workplace. Mississippi does not have that. They have the federal laws, Title VII, ADA, ADEA, which is the Age Discrimination Act, and Employment Section 504, which is also a disability related act. But Mississippi, and of course, there's the federal Fair Labor Standards Act, which has to do with your wages and employment. But those things, Mississippi does not have its own minimum wage. You've heard a lot maybe about the wage gap between men and women in the state of Mississippi. Mississippi also does not have its own laws as it pertains to that. So Mississippi is not the most progressive when it comes to that, but you do have rights. And there, because Mississippi doesn't have its state law, you have to follow the federal procedure when you want to engage the Title VII protections. You have to go through the EEOC if you're going to want to file a lawsuit, and there are time limitations related to that.
Yeah.
And so that is something I do find that even a lot of my clients are not initially aware of, but you do have rights. You cannot be discriminated against. Now, let me back up and say that there's at-will employment in most situations. If you don't have an employment contract in a business law class, I know you all know all about contracts. If you don't have an employment contract, you are an at-will employee, which means you can basically be fired for any reason, as long as it's not a discriminatory purpose. And in this state, what you have is the Civil Rights Act of 1964 is amended, and that protects you for race and gender discrimination, national origin and religion, creed, color, things like that. And then, of course, as I mentioned, the Americans with Disability Act, the Age Discrimination Act. Those are the laws, the federal laws that protect you as an employee in the state of Mississippi.
Yeah, and we just had all those on our last test too. But
Wow, good.
yeah, and again, even though it's more and more, it's less and less common now. It's important to know those things because on the Fair Labor Standards Act, that states that, if you are working overtime, they can't just pay you your regular rate if you're working over 40 hours. So it's not about what they can afford or what's right or wrong. The law says if you're an hourly employee and you're working over 40 hours, they have to pay you your overtime. And that's why, we talk about read your pay stub. Make sure people aren't cheating you out of your money.
Make sure that you're classified correctly as an employee, because that makes a difference too, whether you're classified as an independent contractor. Those things do matter, whether you're a non-exempt employee, because there are different provisions that apply if you are an exempt employee.
Yeah, and we also talked about workers' comp. Even if you're 15, 16 years old, you're still, if you are working, you're entitled to workers' compensation. And I'm sure you've seen a lot of that in your day as well. So talk a little bit about how that works, because if somebody's injured on the job, whether it's just a minor injury or heaven forbid a major injury, they didn't know what they're entitled to. It doesn't mean you're going to be stuck with a bunch of huge medical bills.
Right. And so let me be honest and tell you, I don't do a lot of workers' compensation work. But again, when you're injured on the job, you do have a right to pursue workers' compensation. Most employers of a certain size have that insurance coverage. And so the best thing I can tell you to do is report the injury immediately, because the statutory limitations of when you can file your claim for your injury is very short. I believe it's 6 months, but that may not be correct. Like I said, that's not my main area of practice, but it's something you should automatically report. Make sure that you get incident reports. If you got to go to the doctor, go to the doctor. And that's for anybody, whether it's personal injury, go to the doctor if you're hurt, because it's easier for you to explain it on the front end than to wait several months and then go, and then they ask you, well, why didn't you go to the doctor? So please do that.
Yeah, and I think that's important to say, because I've said with a lot of our guests, it doesn't matter what we think is right or wrong. It matters what the law says.
Right.
And you can cry all day long. You can say it's not fair, but at the end of the day, a judge has to go by what the law of the state of Mississippi or the law of the United States says. So it's important to be aware of that, because, again, they're 15, 16, 17 years old now. They may think, oh, this is stupid, it's not going to apply to me, until it does.
Right.
So it's just very important to be aware of what you have the rights to and not let people take advantage of you. And one thing, my mother she'll come to this class later in the semester. She's a realtor, and she talks about, when it comes to contracts, especially with first-time home buyers and minority home buyers, not getting cheated out of money, letting somebody give you a bad contract, and then you're on the hook for money that, oh, nobody told me about that. So you have to be aware of that stuff.
Yeah, and you have to read it. A lot of times, even when you are presented with an employment contract, some of them include I don't know if your class, I'm sure you've heard of arbitration clauses. Some of them include arbitration clauses, and the employee does not always read that, but that will limit your ability in some cases. So if you need to uh, file suit or pursue a claim against your employer, if you've signed an arbitration clause, you may not be able to go to Hinds County Court or Madison County. You may not be able to, or federal court. You may have to go through an arbitrator. So that's important that you read those things, and they will gloss over it. But your responsibility is to read any paper that's put in front of you that relates to your rights, whether it be their handbook. You've got to read those things so that you know, because they're not going to always be as proactive as they should be in making sure you understand what you have a right to.
Yeah, and there are actually a lot of places are counting on you not reading it, and they've heard this story 1,000 times. But the one I always say, when I was working in a restaurant, they gave me this long checklist of things I had to agree to, and one of those things was I had to agree to wear the proper equipment while I was in the kitchen, which included slip-proof shoes. And I was like, man, these things are hurting my feet. And I stopped wearing them. I didn't wear them one time, and I slipped like a Looney Tunes Bug Bunny on a banana peel. And luckily, I wasn't seriously injured. But I did hurt my back, and that could have been a big deal. And if that would have gone to court, they could have said he didn't wear the slip-proof shoes, and he signed right here that he would. I could have been in a world of hurt. So again, it doesn't matter what's right or wrong. I signed that I would wear it, and I didn't do it. I didn't have any legal leg to stand on that.
Right. You're absolutely right.
Now, at another thing, we have an entrepreneurship program here as well, and we hear a lot of kids say, oh, "I'm just going to open my own business. I want to do my things my own way, be my own boss." But also, when somebody is starting a business, there's a lot of legal, not a whole lot, but there's still a few legal steps depending on the business that have to be gone through in order to legally have a business, to legally open depending on what you're selling. There's licenses involved. So if you're helping someone start a business, if they have an LLC and they want to open a business, what are some things legally that they need to be aware of when it comes to not just in Mississippi, but in other parts of the country, as far as legal things they need to be aware of starting a business?
Um, well, where you're starting your business, where you're if you're doing it in corporation, where you're incorporated may matter. Some states, so a lot of businesses incorporate in Delaware or somewhere like that, not necessarily in the state of Mississippi. And what their laws may be more friendly if you get sued or if there's a liability issue or something that comes up. Those considerations are important for whatever, depending on what type of business you're doing. Once you file your LLC paperwork, as you mentioned, that may not be enough. You need to have an operating agreement. A lot of businesses don't have those, but you need to have one that says what's going to happen if we need to dissolve or if we need to get a loan. Do we need a board to approve this? Do we need the managers to approve this? How do we want those things to work? Those things are very important. Now, that's internal, but you still should have it. If you need a business license in the city of Jackson, you're going to have to go down there and get it or apply for it. So you need to do the research and find out if that's something that your particular type of business is going to need. If you have to have a professional license, so for instance, you can't just put a law firm up because you want to have a law firm. You have to have a licensed attorney, and you need to be licensed. Somebody has to be licensed in that state. So those are things that are very important. You need to know what regulations apply to your industry, whether it be OSHA, which is Occupational Safety Act, those things, whether there's unions involved. Now, we know there's not a lot of union involvement in the state of Mississippi, but so the National Labor Relations Act, those type of things may apply to your business. It may vary based on the size and number of employees that you have, but those are things that you need to be aware of because ignorance of the law is generally not a defense. So
Yeah.
you got to make sure you do that research on the front end.
Yeah, and anytime there's anybody's health involved, because if you want to be you want to have a pharmacy, you got to have a license with the state pharmacy board. If you want to open a restaurant, you can be the greatest cook in the world, but if you don't pass if you can't pass a health department inspection and have a ServSafe certification, or in a food and beverage license, it doesn't matter how good your food is, you can't open.
Absolutely.
So again, I really encourage these kids, because I have so many all the time to say they want to be entrepreneurs, and that's great because there is definite opportunity, especially for Black business owners in the state of Mississippi. But there are things that have to be done first, and that's where they could come to someone like you and say, "Hey, I need this set up," and and that way the ignorance of the law you talk about isn't a factor. And I think it's important because people say, "I don't want to pay for an attorney." Well, would you rather pay a few $1,000s for an attorney to start up, or would you rather get hit with a $50,000 fine and have your business closed? You have to got to look at the cost of the opportunity cost on that one.
Yeah, and luckily, number one, you all have the resource of this business law class, which will help you tremendously because if you don't know what all you need to know, at least you have some idea. There's some people who try and start up and have no idea where they even need to. They don't know, should I be an LLC or should I be an incorporation or should I be a sole proprietor? What does that mean? What do you mean liability? What does limited liability mean? Those are questions that people have, and you can explain those different business types and what the tax ramifications and the liability ramifications are. But there's so many resources. Small Business Association, SBA.gov has a lot of resources, and just because you're not 18 does not mean that you can't go and look at these resources. There's videos they have on the website. There's information. There's, if you don't like to read stuff, you can watch the presentations. There's absolutely numerous resources that'll tell you what do you do when you need funding? How do you write a business plan? Do I need a business plan? The answer is yes, regardless of what size you plan your business to be. Those resources are all there for you if you're curious about that. I will tell you that being an entrepreneur is not for the weak because there's ups and downs to any sort of business. But if you're prepared for it, you'll do well.
Yeah, and that just all goes to planning. As much as I get frustrated when I see kids that'll come out of here and they'll start going, I get frustrated with their pricing, but I'll get more frustrated they haven't done the legal legwork ahead of time as well. So it is a a common mistake among teenagers and young business owners. But I do have a few questions from the students. I'll get to the as many of these as I can.
All
This
right.
one is Kwame Johnson. He's a sophomore, and
Okay, Mr. Johnson.
he asked, "What type of classes or major in college would I need to do in order to get into law school?"
Uh, what's your passion? Because to go to law school, you can major in dance, you can major in nursing, you can major in English. I was a business major. I focused on marketing. It just depends on what your passion is, what you would do if you don't practice law, or what area of law you're thinking about getting into. If you want to be in health law and work with hospitals, then it may be better for you to do something that involves public health, or even go to medical school. There's a joint program at some law schools where you can do a JD, MD. I don't, that's a lot of work, but it's possible if that's something that you're interested in doing. Lawyers often use consultants who are medical doctors or dentists. And so it just depends on what you really want to do, what your passion is, what your focus is going to be. And that may change when you get to law school, but there's no particular field that you have to focus on to go to law school. You just need to be able to be disciplined, study, have time management, and know that you're going to have to do a lot of reading. And so, and think logically about things and processes. So if you can do that, it doesn't matter what your major is.
Yeah, and I think it also important if somebody's interested in a legal career. One, every field has legal professionals, but if you're interested in a legal career, you have to think about how often would you really want to go to court, because
Right.
we see the very minuscule amount that's so glamorous and stuff for television drama, but that is a very very small amount of actual attorneys. Because a friend of mine who's with Berkeley
Correct.
in downtown Jackson, he does construction contracts, and he's like, "Look, I used to watch Law and Order, and I just saw myself nailing somebody on a witness stand, and that never happens."
Right.
Yeah, he
There's
goes to
some
court maybe twice a
attorneys,
year, so yeah, it's very.
right. Exactly. There's some attorneys that are just they're considered to be what they call transactional lawyers. So they do a lot of writing of contracts and things like that. But actual courtroom, if you want courtroom experience, most people would tell you to go practice criminal law, because those are the lawyers that are in the courtroom the most.
Yeah.
But all firms, even small firms, have some litigation usually that's involved, even if it's a state claim, because sometimes those get contested as well. But the most courtroom experience is not going to be from being doing transactional work.
Yeah, and even a lot of the personal injury guys, a lot of their stuff is settled out of court. A lot of times they never even step foot in a courtroom. So it really is, depending on how comfortable you are and what your passion is, because there is so many different legal careers that in every field. So it really, I agree, and he's really interested in engineering, but there's
Oh, that's
engineering
wonderful.
firms definitely need legal professionals. This is Rodarius Williams. He's a senior, and he asked, what were some of the prerequisites of and processes you went through before you opened your own business?
Well, Mr. Williams, I'll tell this is my second law firm. My initial law firm that I started on actually February 1st of 2010, and I had two business partners in DC, and we spent the entire year before we opened researching small law firms, researching the market in DC, because there's tons of lawyers in DC. DC has, I believe, like 8 area law schools, and then the federal government has all these attorneys, and there's several major law firms there. So we researched that. Well, what services do they offer? What practice areas do they cover? Where can we compete? What do we know? Where can we grow? So we spent time doing that market research. We talked to financial planners. We went to every class that the DC Bar offered on starting a law firm. We went to all of those classes. The three of us each went there. I got the information. We got whatever resources we could get from the DC Bar. We talked to other attorneys that had their own practices about how do you scale it? How do you start? What cases do you take? What cases do you stay away from? Or should that be a consideration when you first start? And so that's the types of things we did. And of course, like I said, we went to the SBA and we looked at those things that they had to offer. And so you got to do the research, and it's a lot of work. And like I said, we spent an entire year doing that before we opened our firm.
Wow. And I think that's another mistake a lot of people make, is they open too quickly or they grow too quickly. So it really definitely is a process. Now this is a great question. This is Darius Cooper. He's a sophomore, and he asked, "What kind of experience do you have with cases involving racism?"
Oh, quite a bit at this point. I actually was barred in 2000. I graduated 2005. I didn't get to swear in until after Christmas of 2000, in January of 2006, because I got licensed in Georgia and I was in DC, so I had to swear in by proxy. But I've been practicing since 2005-ish. And most of my cases are employment cases, and a lot of them involve race discrimination. Even some of I do very little criminal work, but sometimes there's race elements and components to that. And it shows up in various forms. Sometimes it's very subtle. It can be a pattern of discrimination or a practice. And there's when you study this, you learn that there's a difference between disparate impact and disparate treatment, which treatment refers to a particular person's impact can be a policy that affects a lot of different people. And sometimes it's like that. Um, it shows up in various ways. And people tend to, even when it's blatant, write things down that they shouldn't write down, which helps us prove our cases. But it's not always blatant, but it happens more often than, I mean, it keeps me busy, so I won't complain about it, but it happens quite a lot.
Yeah, and I always tell them about, the key word in any employment case is always going to be reasonable accommodation as well. Because I was an employee at Georgia Blue when they had the big lawsuit about the girl wearing the skirt at work for religious purposes, and that was religious discrimination, and it was a slam dunk case because it said clear as day in the emails, you have to wear pants to work here, and that's not a reasonable accommodation. So that was a huge violation of civil rights. It violated her religious liberties. And obviously she won the case, and I still think she didn't get enough money, but that's what she was after. But again, if something is not affecting your job performance, you have the right to work in a discrimination-free environment, and that'd be for anybody. In her case, it was religious, but letting something like that go is where people make the mistake. She did take care of it very quickly. This is Brian.
Yes.
He's a senior, and he asked, if you ever have a client that's about to testify, how long do you spend preparing them?
That depends. It depends on the complexities in the case. You want to spend some time because clients will always surprise you, whether it's going to be a trial testimony or a hearing testimony or a deposition. You want to take time and go through the elements of their claim, making sure they know how to answer questions. You don't tell them what to say. The answer is always tell the truth. But you do need to help them understand what questions they may be asking, prepare them to how they will be expected to respond in those instances. So that can take, depending on the client and the type of case, that could take an hour or that could take several days. It really just depends on what's involved in the case.
Wow. Yeah. And again, I think it would depend on how much money's at stake or anybody's freedom at stake as well. Now, here's a great question. This is James Jackson. He's a senior. And he asked, in my earlier years of school, I wanted to be an attorney, but I changed my mind because I heard law school was very difficult. Is it as difficult as people say it is?
I'm not gonna lie to you. It's a lot of work, but it's not difficult if you put your mind to it. If this is what you want to do, then certainly you can do it. Is it a lot of hours of reading and studying? Yes. When I went to Southern Miss, I was a business major and I didn't have to study that much. I graduated with a 3.8 something GPA from Southern Miss with honors. And I didn't have to go to the library very much. I just didn't. But when I went to law school, I had to spend a lot of hours reading a lot of things because there's case law, there's changes to the law, there's understanding how to even research the law. And so that took a little more time in writing notes than I was used to. And it's not an easy process, mostly because you're placed in a situation where it's meant to be competitive. And so they kind of force you to try to be better than the next so that you can excel in the program. It's just law schools are just designed that way. And I don't necessarily think that's the best design, but that's just how it is. But if this is what you want to do, it's not something that you can't handle. It's just like I'm going to medical school, and I will say at least I didn't have to cut up a cadaver like my roommate. She had to deal with a cadaver because she was in dental school. I didn't have to do anything. I wouldn't have made it if I had to do that. So it's not easy. I'm not gonna lie to you, but you can do the work if that's what you really are focused on and want to do.
Yeah, and again, and because it's so diverse, I think once you get into law school, you can really find your way. Because once that you get through that first year of law school, that's when you really focus on your concentration, and that's where you could really find what area of law you'd really be interested in.
Right. And I will tell you, first year is probably the most difficult because once you get past that, I won't call it hazing, but it's kind of what it feels like a little bit. When I was at Howard, our first semester, we had 9 credit hours. And it, we managed. Our second semester was 21 credit hours.
Ooh.
So it was a different amount of work, but we were trained in that first semester with those 9 hours. What are some good study methods? How do you work, study groups? How do you do this? How do you understand how to read the law? How do you understand what we call case briefing? We were trained to do all of that so that when we got to the 21 hours, it wasn't just a total dump on us. You were prepared to kind of deal with how to process and study that information.
Yeah. And again, and that would be in any type of professional school, learning how to work with your, use your resources. You can't be scared to work with other people, especially in the legal field. But yeah, that's what
And
I've
you
heard.
can't be scared to ask questions.
Yeah,
Get to a level when you get in college, you almost feel like you're expected to know things. But if you don't know, ask. And who cares if somebody else thinks it's a stupid question? Ask the question because I guarantee you're not the only one who doesn't know.
exactly. I say that all the time. I'm like, they get scared to ask me a question. I'm like, I promise you, somebody's asked this before. So and then they wind up wasting time. I'm like, we could have gotten this done a lot sooner. I just got
Yeah.
one more from the students. This is Jada Green. She's a sophomore, one of our cheerleaders here at Belmont.
Green.
And she asked, "What was your biggest inspiration to go into the law?"
Okay. And this is going to sound funny considering how we started this conversation, but when I was about 13 or 14, I was on a trip with my family. Uh, we have a big military family, so we're kind of spread out across the country. And we were driving from Mississippi to California, which is a long trip to visit one of my family members that was stationed out in California. And we stopped at an aunt's house along the way, and she was watching Law and Order. And I saw that, and I was like, "Ah, I'm gonna do that. I'm gonna be a lawyer. Of course, I never wanted to be a criminal lawyer. And it's good work for those who love it, and it's necessary. But that just wasn't what moved me. But I watched that, and then I started to learn more about Thurgood Marshall and his connection to Howard Law School, and that's when I knew that's where I want to go. And so, just reading about that in the civil rights movement, Brown versus Board of Education, all of that at a younger age, I was just so inspired. I knew I didn't want to do anything else.
Yeah, that's awesome. Now we're almost out of time, and we thank you so much for taking some time out of
Oh, you're welcome.
But before we go, I always tell these kids, you may not think this is important, you may think this is boring, but how important is it to at least be familiar with these legal issues as they get out of high school and get ready to move on to their next step?
Oh my goodness. Right now it's very important. All you have to do is watch the news or read posts on Twitter, Facebook, TikTok, whatever it is that social media that you like. There's a lot going on legally right now, and you need to know, is this something that's affecting my constitutional right, my, personal freedom? These are things that you need to know and be aware of because things are happening. And if people are not saying, hey, this is not right and speaking up, then you get run over. So it is very, very important, especially right now. And if you're over the 18 or over, please register and please vote.
Yeah, and that's a whole different conversation. But I've always said, I will never in my life, as a teacher, tell anybody who to vote for. But I have a huge
Exactly.
problem. I have a huge problem when people don't vote, especially, a friend of the class is Justice Jim Kitchens in the Mississippi Supreme Court, and he always says, look, when he was growing up in Copiah County, people were getting killed for Black people to have the right to vote. People were losing their jobs, losing their homes. And now the great thing about votes is me and your vote counts exactly the same. That's the one equalizer. And again, I don't give a flip who anybody votes for, but people need to be informed and they need to exercise their right that other countries do not have.
Exactly. I agree.
And if you want to see change in the law, that's where it starts. And we have our state election coming up in November for our state
That's
offices. They've already started campaigning. So those that are going to be
right.
18 really need to pay attention to that because that's where these state laws are going to come into play. So again, Darian Denman, Denman Law, denmanlaw.com. They're right there in the city of Jackson. Thank you so much
Yes.
for joining us today.
Thank you. And just, I think this is great to do this for your students because this is not an opportunity I had, and it's just good to have access to this sort of information. So
Oh,
congratulations to all of you. And this was great.
and thank you so much. And I learned something as well, but to the top, and hopefully I'll see you at Hattiesburg sometime.
All right.
All right. See ya.
Bye.